Hi everyone, welcome to this first Wednesday night bite of the new academic year for the Horror Studies SIG, the BAFTSS Horror Studies SIG. And I'm guessing a lot of you are regulars or have come specifically because of this event, so we'll know at least some of us. But just to introduce us, I'm Kate Egan, and with Laura Mee and Shelley McMurdo with the three conveners of the BAFTSS Horror Studies SIG. Really pleased to say that tonight's event, kind of kicking off our year of events, is a book launch and panel discussion for a book by Laura Mee called Reanimated, the Contemporary American Horror Remake. Just before we begin the panel, now you saw a sneak preview of the book itself, which many of you may have already bought and read and enjoyed. I know I have. But now I'm going to hand over to the chair of tonight's panel. Very happy to say we've got Iain Roberts-Smith, who'll be chairing tonight's discussion. Iain, of course, is a senior lecturer in film studies at King's College London, and also he's a founding member of the BAFTSS Horror Studies SIG, so it's really great to have him here chairing this discussion. So just going to hand straight over to you, Iain.
Brilliant, thanks, Kate. Yeah, and thanks to you, Kate, Laura, and Shelley for inviting me to do this. Like I've been really impressed with what you've put together with this BAFTSS kind of horror group. I think all these online events, it's been such a kind of impressive range of talks and online kind of roundtables throughout the pandemic. That's been, it's been really fantastic.
It's kept us all sane, I think.
Yeah,
or maybe.
Yeah, a little bit sane. But yeah, so I think, I'm just really delighted to be able to kind of chair this session, to talk with you, Laura, about your work, and then we'll kind of open it out to our panel, who I'll introduce in a moment after we've kind of talked a little bit between the two of us. So I guess initially, so this book, which, I've got my copy here as well.
Hey, oh, that looks like mine.
Reanimated, a Contemporary American Horror Remake. Like, is this, what's the genesis for this book? What made you decide? Because I understand this was your PhD. You must have been working on this a long time. Like, what was the kind of initial point where you were like, okay, I need to do a whole PhD on this. I need to turn it into a book. This is the topic for me.
Okay, well, before I say it, I just want to say thanks very much to you for chairing, and thank you very much to Bruna and to Kathleen and Kendall for joining us as well, and to thank an awful lot of people who are here, which I'm not going to do one by one, because there's already an acknowledgements page for that, but there's lots of people here who helped the book get here, and it would be remiss of me to not say thank you. So lots of friends, family and colleagues. Sam from EUP is here as well, I know, and various others, so I'm really grateful for all the support, and especially for people turning out tonight. I'm excited and a little bit nervous to talk about it. In terms of the genesis of the project, I mean, actually, we say it's my PhD, but actually I did my undergrad dissertation in 2008 on a couple of these horror remakes, on Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Dawn of the Dead, and Hills Have Eyes. And really, I guess, kind of working at an undergraduate level without thinking as critically about them as I then went on to do. I did my my master's in independent study, which was on American remakes of Japanese horror films, and that really kind of, getting to do an awful lot more research around adaptation studies in particular that had kind of swelled and developed in the mid 2000s and really kind of offered some interesting new areas for research. And started my PhD in 2010. And I think it just kind of coincided with a moment at the end of the 2000s. There were lots and lots of these remakes about, and things seemed to be coming out kind of thick and fast. It really started with Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 2003, although there were a few things prior to that. But Texas Chainsaw comes out in 2003, and then throughout the 2000s, especially throughout the second half of the 2000s, there seemed to be an awful lot of them. And as there were an awful lot of remakes, there was also an awful lot of criticism. And the remakes really seem to be dominating horror, or at least the discourse around it, the complaints around it, even though there were lots of other things happening in the genre at the time, like the rise of found footage, torture porn. And the remakes received an awful lot of backlash, and that had been the case for a number of years. The response to TCM wasn't particularly kind, even though it was very, you know, very popular and made a lot of money. But it seemed to me that despite all that criticism, they were really prevalent, and not just as a cycle of remakes, but connected to other cycles, other things that were happening in horror at the time, particularly torture porn. But the popularity that a lot of these films had and the money that they made, it seemed quite silly to me that they weren't considered part of the genre proper, that they were kind of sidelined and kind of, you know, disavowed, kind of pushed away from discussions and understandings of the genre. And I thought that was a bit daft, given how prevalent they were. And I think, you know, as I said, lots of much more interesting and useful research on remakes and seriality appearing in the mid-2000s. Con Verevas's book, Film Remakes in particular, I think provided lots of new ways of looking at remakes much more seriously in terms of kind of industry and reception contexts, which helped to kind of reframe some of these ideas. And I think that was kind of catching up with adaptation studies. Adaptation studies was starting to do lots more work in intertextual, you know, on intertextuality, and to think more about kind of industry, and to move away from solely looking at kind of prestige literature and so on, as you yourself know, your area of study as well. So I think really it was a lucky moment of these things colliding and just kind of deciding to run with it. And that was 2010 when I started the PhD. So really the rest of it kind of grew from there. Yeah.
Fantastic. And I guess because part of what you're kind of referring to there is that idea of these remakes. Yeah, so a film like the 2003 Texas Chainsaw Massacre getting some kind of critical backlash. So it's financially successful, but critics, many fans are kind of saying these remakes are pointless, the originals are far superior. Yeah. And I guess, I mean, that's the kind of thing we hear a lot about remakes. Generally, there's an idea that remakes are inevitably just kind of crass and commercial and pointless, and you know, there's a whole discourse around that anyway. Do you feel there's anything about horror particularly that lends itself to that critique? Like, are these just criticized because they're remakes, or is there something about horror fandom?
I think very possibly, yeah. I think, you know, horror gets a lot of horror films get criticized along the same lines for being pointless or for being kind of crass, or you know. And I think that if horror was kind of a low form of cultural entertainment, and if remaking was also considered a low form of cultural entertainment, then horror remakes are kind of the lowest of the low. So I think they'd been perhaps particularly subject to these kind of discussions. But I also think, you know, horror has a really vociferous, really passionate fan base, and I think that understandably a lot of fans and audiences respond to remakes in particular ways that are shaped by their own feelings about the originals. So I think that perhaps the genre is slightly more prone to those kind of arguments. Sure. Yeah, definitely. I think that the idea of pointlessness is particularly interesting. We talk like this discussion, that this idea, this talking point that remakes generally are pointless, that horror remakes are pointless. There's no point in their existence. You know, why does anybody have to remake some of these films? And I think the first thing there is that we have to tackle this idea that you know, commercial film production is dirty in some way, that you know, that there's little value in commercial production. And we can think of any text that exists as having some kind of artistic merit, sure, and we can examine it in those ways. But we also have to understand that ultimately anything produced in commercial sense, you know, the industry is just that, it's an industry, and we do have to consider these things in commercial contexts. And the idea of remaking is very appealing, and the value of them can therefore be monetary. And I don't think it's necessarily a terrible thing to acknowledge that. You know, remakes of existing work mean that production can be, you know, cheaper, because lots of the things that kind of take place in the kind of ideation stage of pre-production already kind of exist. There's lots to kind of work with. Production is cheaper because of existing intellectual property and so on. Ready-made audiences, you've got audiences who will be the first to complain about these things, but will also be the first to go and see it opening weekend. And I think you know, there's a lot of appeal in that regard then to studios. but there's other ways in which they might have points, you know, not just that they're commercially viable, but then their own viability as text kind of contribute to the continuation of the genre and to further horror production. And I think that that's really significant. There's also opportunities, obviously, in remaking or in adaptation for kind of formal or aesthetic experimentation, the opportunity to play around a little bit with things because they already exist, and perhaps people don't need to be so precious about it because, you know, because they're already you know, quote unquote, like desecrating these texts. They can do, you know, various different things in terms of text and theme. So in terms of aesthetic and theme. So that's kind of interesting as well. And potentially, you know, opportunities to address issues with older texts in terms of representation, for example, or to address new cultural contexts. So something like the recent Candyman film that came out, not quite a sequel, not quite a remake, which I know we're going to talk about later. You know, having the opportunity to address some of those existing criticisms of earlier films. So lots and lots of alternate points to accusations of pointlessness, I think.
And do you often find yourself having to defend the films, I guess against other fans, against academics? Like, is that, do you find that becomes your role?
Yeah, a little bit, I think. And sometimes it's tiring because, you know, obviously there's some of them that I don't like myself very much. I think I'm happily acknowledge that. So there's a sense of, you know, having to oppose the devil's advocate opinion that, you know, that surely lots of remakes are just terrible in and of themselves. And I think that's, I mean, it's subjective, obviously. Certainly, I think there are some remakes that are better than their original films, and an awful lot of remakes that are not as good as their original films. But I tried to be really objective the whole time that I was looking at this stuff, and look at it through that lens of adaptation, and think about sort of less about value and more about kind of, you know, interesting context in which they could be considered. I think there's only one point in the book actually where I kind of, because I had to acknowledge this I wanted to acknowledge this in the introduction, this idea that it's quite difficult to be objective when you're studying something that you care about, and I use the example of Nightmare on Elm Street, which I know is one that doesn't have very many fans, and I'm certainly not counted among them, but I think there's, you know, really interesting ways to look at that film. I've just seen, I presume that's Shelley who's just said the Crazies remake is better than the original and we can fight her. I wouldn't fight her, I'd be inclined to agree, but, you know, that might be sacrilege to some people, but yeah, I think it's a stronger film. But yes, I do find myself kind of having to defend them, and it's interesting. It doesn't always go well, but
no, it sounds good. Do you think, I mean, is this a kind of inevitable part of them, of a kind of audience response to film serials, sequels, to remakes? Like, do you feel like, is this a hurdle that can be overcome at some point? Do you feel like that the kind of disdain towards horror remakes will change and evolve? Like, maybe your book might contribute towards a kind of reorientation of the debate in some way?
I'd hope that it does, at least academically. I think you know, the first kind of, I'm not going to obviously name stuff here, but the first stuff that came out in terms of scholarly studies of horror remakes was very much like, you know, work on remakes or work on adaptation even that had come out decades prior, that was, you know, very kind of intent on privileging original over remake, really not interested in looking at the context within which the remake itself exists, and very much just looking at it in a vacuum in comparison to its original film as a case study. And I do think that that's definitely moved on in scholarly terms. I think we've got much more interesting and much more productive academic models for understanding adaptation and seriality and remaking now. Whether that has moved on in kind of critical spheres and in terms of audiences, I think audiences are much more sophisticated at understanding that concept of seriality and continuation and so on. But I guess it just transfers to other areas. I'm thinking of, you know, the critical backlash that like the ongoing Marvel Cinematic Universe or something like that now faces with, you know, accusations of things just being churned out endlessly and pointlessly and so on, and I can see that those arguments perhaps just move to a new group of films. I'm trying to think whether whether there is really any kind of positivity. You see kind of positive responses to things, to new kind of horror adaptations, new horror serials coming out. I'm thinking of the Hellraiser trailer, which has come out in the last couple of weeks, seems to have had a really good response for a number of reasons. But equally, things come out and people ask why, and I think those things kind of stick. So yeah, I'm not sure if it has changed. I'm not sure if that answers the question, but I'm not sure if it has changed. Certainly academically, but I don't know to what use, more commercially or critically. Yeah,
but no, that's a good, because I guess a lot of the kind of spur behind lots of remake scholarship, because you mentioned Convervis's kind of work, and I guess Lucy Masden as well, like there's an idea that all Hollywood remakes of French cinema must obviously be terrible and commercial and have no value, and then she kind of takes them seriously and studies them and helps kind of change the debate, even if she personally doesn't love every single one or think that it's necessarily superior to the original or anything like that. There's
absolutely
things we can learn from them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. And I think that, there's lots of much more interesting work on remaking and seriality, doing that very thing, and considering more important and more useful context for looking at them. Your own work, Kathleen, who's on the panel today, some fantastic work there. People like Claire Perkins, lots and lots. Again, can't list everybody, but lots of really useful work on seriality and remaking as part of that now, I think.
So I guess, before we kind of open out to the panel and then to questions from our audience as well, just because I'm aware that we've kind of talked quite kind of generally about the kind of remakes, like what were, in writing the book, what were some of your favorite case studies to write about? What were the ones that you kind of really enjoyed getting into?
I actually found something redeeming or fun in researching or analysing most of the films that I looked at. There were some that I got a little tired of going over and over and over again. There's a chapter on rape revenge, and watching and re-watching Last House on the Left and I Spit on Your Grave, both versions repeatedly for 6 months at a time took a toll after a while. But even the films which seem to kind of incur most of the complaints, so the Platinum Dunes reboots, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, even though I don't necessarily love them in their own right, I know Texas Chainsaw and Friday the 13th especially have both had kind of renewed fan and audience interest, and they seem to be being reappraised a little bit. And I don't particularly love either of them, but I did find Platinum Dunes a really fascinating case study, just looking at them from an industrial perspective and thinking about how they'd kind of marketed and branded themselves as this kind of the house the remake built, like in response to New Line being the house that Freddie built. And I thought that was really, really interesting. In terms of stuff that I actually love, there's some that I'm very fond of. I really like the Crazies remake. I really like The Hills Have Eyes. But my two absolute favorites, I think Evil Dead is a fantastic remake, because I think the two that I really love, Evil Dead and Maniac, and it's really interesting actually, they both come out right at the end of the period that I most focus on, so they come out both in 2013. And they both, I think, are kind of perhaps responding quite cleverly to a lot of the complaints about those remakes during the 2000s, which was that they weren't doing anything creative, they weren't doing anything interesting, they were just out for money grabbing producers. And I think that actually Evil Dead does something really interesting in terms of changing its story, changing its form, changing its characters, to respond to kind of, you know, fan concerns about Ash being recast, for example, but also just goes completely all out on practical effects and gore, and just really amps up that stuff which Sam Raimi's film was well loved for. And I think even though it does it with a very different tone to Raimi's film, I think that it's, you know, really unique in its own way. So I really love Evil Dead for that. And I also really love Maniac. I think Maniac's such a clever example of experimentation in terms of camera work and the way that film was put together. And it's just really chilling as a result. I think really kind of unpleasant, deeply disgusting, and horrible, and all that POV that it uses very cleverly kind of amplifies that, but also draws from an awful lot of interesting sources and stylistic influences. You know, there's definitely some kind of giallo theme there, and so on. I just think it's a really fascinating film, and I, you know, very much liked it. And it stars Elijah Wood, so, you know, I'm always happy with that. So.
That sounds great. Yeah, and I guess, yeah, I mean, I'll kind of open it to our panel just now to see if they've got any questions. But I think, yeah, there's so many things we can return to as we go through. So yeah, just to introduce some of our panel just now. So we've got Kathleen Loock from Leibniz University in Hannover, who has just finished the manuscript for her book Hollywood Remaking. And she's also the director of the research group Hollywood Memories, Cinematic Remaking, the Construction of Global Movie Generations. So has, yeah, really fantastic work around, yeah, remakes and reboots and serialization. We've also got on this panel Bruna Foletto Lucas from Kingston University, who's doing a PhD on the role and impact of women in horror films, including women directors of horror remakes of earlier horror films. And we've also got on our panel Kendall Phillips from Syracuse University, who many of you know, the author of Place of Darkness, The Rhetoric of Horror in Early American Cinema, and also Projected Fears, Horror Films in American Culture. So yeah, we're really kind of delighted to have all three of you kind of joining the panel and kind of discussing Laura's book and the themes that are coming out of it. I guess what might be good before I kind of go into just kind of specific questions and ideas is whether any of the three of you have any questions you'd like to ask Laura, responding to this discussion, or about the book more generally. Anyone like to start us off?
Maybe I can start.
Yep.
Hello, everyone, and hello again, Laura and Iain, and congratulations first on the publication of the book, which is a great book. So I'm very happy. I'm still waiting for my copy too. I think a few people said that before, but I had the chance to look at it before this, and it's really it's a great contribution to remake studies and to horror studies as well, I think. And I guess my question would be, because you already said you started in the 2000 and then your PhD in 2010. And I'm just thinking a lot of things have changed while you were writing your book. So, and my main question would be, like, how did you deal with all those changes? I mean, there are a few books coming out also on horror remakes, like David Roche's book and also Christian Knöppler's book, which are specifically about horror film remakes, but which are very different. And I really like your take on them, actually. So it's a great addition to the kind of horror remakes books that are out there now. And of course, also terms like, I mean, you already mentioned seriality and so on, but also the notion of the reboot that, while you were writing, I think has undergone like a complete change and is no longer the same. And I think you do that very well in the book, and we can talk more about that. But maybe just you can say something about the changes that were, like, the things that were going on while you were writing the book and how you dealt with them.
Yeah, happy to. I mean, I remember David's book coming out almost just at the point where I was actually about to submit, and had that horrible panic that you do when you're doing a PhD and somebody just gets in there just as you're about to submit. admit. And I think it's a great book. I think there's a lot of very useful case studies in there, and the same with Christian's book as well. I think there's very, very useful kind of paired case studies thinking about how things have kind of changed, particularly culturally. You know, Christian's looking very much at the concept of monsters and how they kind of evolve and change over time, and I think we'll probably pick up on this in a little while, and I think does so very effectively. And David is looking very much at kind of political and cultural context in particular. I think his book is very effective at doing that. What I really wanted to do differently, and so I was glad to see that I was kind of taking a different angle, is to think about the kind of key sort of reception context, industry context of the remake within horror specifically. So I was very interested in connecting the horror remake to other things that were going on in the genre at the time. So perhaps I was coming at it from a slightly different angle, as maybe at the time primarily a horror scholar rather than an adaptation scholar, and then just kind of merging the two together and hoping it stuck, and I hope that has worked. So I do think there's a difference there. And I also, in terms of the things that have changed, yeah, you're absolutely right. It's so fast changing. I think, you know, part of that is contribution of new work within remaking, seriality, and adaptation studies, and part of that is just new forms of adaptation themselves, or new ways of understanding adaptation themselves. And if I had my time again, if I could rewind kind of a year or even 2 years and find an extra 10 or 20,000 words to include in the book, I think it would have been really great, for example, to include more on TV horror. I think obviously the book has very much a kind of film remit. I talk about television a little bit, particularly in the conclusion, because in the sort of early to mid 2010s, around the time that I was finishing this, you were starting to see things coming out that were kind of new forms of adaptation or remaking, but in serial forms on television. And I really would have liked to have talked to him much more depth about those examples, because there was tons of stuff coming out in the 2010s. You know, Bates Motel and other things that I can't think of the name of at the minute, which is terrible because there's literally a list of them in my conclusion. But Stella Gaynor, who's here tonight, actually has done some great work on this, both in her book recently and also in a keynote for 2000 Hannibal. Thank you, Stacey. And you know, lots of new ways of considering kind of appropriating, adapting, remaking those kind of key texts, but in serial forms on TV. So I would have liked to look at that in more depth. And the other thing that I would have liked space to do is something that seems to have become particularly dominant since about 2018 and Halloween, which is the requel or the legacy-quel, which I know Kendall is working on at the moment, which I know you've done some amazing work on, Kathleen, kind of outside but attached to horror by looking at Jurassic World. And I'm doing a little bit on that as well at the minute. But I think, you know, there's obviously really key areas in which those things are changing, and I really would have liked more space to deal with them. So they're kind of, yeah, I think Stacey said these should be your sequels. I think that's probably a nice way of looking at it, as a kind of serial evolving form. Yeah.
Yeah, and yeah, so Bruna or Kendall, do you want to ask a question, and then we'll keep the discussion going?
Yeah, I'd be glad to. First of all, congratulations, Laura. Amazing book, really, really impressive. Thank you all for inviting me across the pond. I wish I could actually flown there and had a pint with you all, but fine, we'll do it this way instead. I always say this as one of the dinosaurs in the world. I'm always amazed to see not just how horror studies has grown, but the horror studies community, because that wasn't always there. And I can remember a time when it felt much more like isolated folks working. And I will say, I think you lot over there in your United Kingdom or semi-United Kingdom, wherever we are today, did a lot of that. I don't know, you know, the Americans are lovely, but I think you all have really helped to create a community, the work that Craig's doing, that Johnny Walker's doing, that you all are doing in the SIG. So thank you on behalf of even those of us over here for helping to make it feel like actually a community and not just alone in a dark basement. But my question, sorry, long-winded American, what did you expect? My question for Laura is, I wonder if you could tease back in time to some of the remake periods that you don't. Naturally, the book picks exactly the right moment when the remake kind of really does take off. So that's not a criticism, but asking, what were your thoughts about like the Dark Castle that took the William Castle and did the remakes, or even earlier, remakes of Jekyll and Hyde was a very popular film, even in the silent era, kind of being adapted and remade and remade. So if you have any thoughts about that earlier period before it became sort of a mania, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one period that's really interesting is that when we talk about remakes, and like, Iain and I were talking at the start about kind of remakes being pointless, remakes receiving a lot of criticism, and then you think about those kind of horror sci-fi hybrids from the early 80s, so The Fly, The Thing, which are adaptations and which are now kind of rightly celebrated almost as originals and considered in their own right. So I think that's a really interesting little cycle. And obviously, Universal and Hammer had kind of remade their own monster movies and each other's monster movies throughout time as well. In terms of the Dark Castle remakes, Simon Brown has talked about these a little bit in some of his work. I think they almost made it in. I almost kind of backtrack a little bit just to the early 2000s, just to kind of scooch that along a little bit. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the reason why I started there was because it very much kind of started a trend in terms of production and financing of those films. But Dark Castle, I think, is interesting as a case study. Texas Chainsaw Massacre just made so much money that it seemed like such a natural kind of point, and also with the space that you have in the book, there's only so much that you can do. But yeah, House on Haunted Hill and The Haunting, both dare I say pretty dreadful remakes, although they have their fun parts. 13 Ghosts, I think, is unfairly maligned. I seem to remember that being a lot of fun, although I haven't seen it for a very long time. And Gus Van Sant's Psycho as well in 1998, which is a really interesting case study. But a lot of scholars had already talked about that. Tom Leach has got considerable a good piece on ways to tell. I can't remember, it's probably 101 ways to tell Gus Van Sant's Psycho from Alfred Hitchcock's. And Con Verivis talks about it in his book quite extensively as well. I think Psycho is a really interesting example for understanding sort of different ways of seriality bleeding into the remake. So it's not just about Hitchcock's film and Van Sant's film in sole opposition to each other, that there's all these kind of circulating extra texts and appropriations and sequels and art forms based on Psycho and all sorts of stuff, and Robert Bloch's novel, and taking all of these different things into consideration to really mess with the idea of there being an original and a remake. So I think Psycho is really interesting from that perspective. Yeah, so I think in terms of, it was actually very difficult kind of making that decision, and obviously there's a commercial aspect there in terms of putting the book together. It makes sense to have a kind of clearly defined era and some clearly defined cycles to talk about. And I hope I've done a reasonable job of justifying that in the book. But definitely, I mean, horror has always had these kind of cycles and these returns and reanimations, I think. And I think Iain's going to ask about that in a bit, so I'm going to draw a line there.
That's good. Yeah, I guess maybe Bruna, if you've got any questions for Laura, and then I'll come to each of you in the panel as well.
I've got no questions.
No questions.
No questions. Everything's been covered already.
I have talked a lot.
So I guess I'll come to back to Kathleen then, because I guess one of the things that has come through in this discussion, and Laura mentioned your work on the Jurassic World film and the franchise, and like, I guess, yeah, how do we grapple with all of the different terms that are being used now to talk about these films, that whether they're remakes and sequels, or reboots, or requels, or legacy quills, or there's all these different terms that people are coming up with to try and work through that relationship between remaking and seriality. So I was wondering if you had thoughts, I guess, drawing on your work on Jurassic World, of what the kind of useful terms are for kind of for using this as scholars.
Kathleen might have frozen. Oh, she's just come back in. I'm sorry. You may have to reiterate your question. She's just rejoining us.
Okay.
I think her connection must have dropped out. But
Connection
she's
maybe
just
dropped.
rejoining. Yeah.
Okay. Well, maybe
she's
I'll
in the waiting room.
Yeah, I'll come back maybe to Kathleen.
Good.
Yeah, let's do that. But yeah, I'll come to Bruna then. So I was just wondering, I guess, given that you've done a lot of work on horror remakes by kind of women directors, what about this idea that kind of Laura was responding to earlier, that these remakes are not simply just kind of commercial properties or just kind of capitalizing on the name value of the original, but they can also kind of respond to issues and problems in the original texts and be updated. I guess especially if you now have a woman director on the film. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do. I actually made a note when Laura said it, because like that's a good way to phrase it. Yeah, so I've been working on this chapter for my PhD that looks at female directed remakes, and I just decided to look at the remakes from recently, and I kind of identified a cycle from 2019 to 2021. With 5 films. You've got Rabid, Black Christmas, The Craft Legacy, Slumber Party Massacre, and Candyman. And I also look at sequels, so it's like remake sequel, that confusing thing that Kathleen should have happened before. But yeah, and then I also identify some outliers in there. For example, Carrie and Rosemary's Baby in 2013 and 14. But I do see that the films nowadays, they're engaging with their previous texts a lot. So I see them as addressing the issues, the criticism that the previous texts have received. Yeah, so I see them as engaging with previous criticism, but also engaging with how horror is quite outspoken now, politically speaking. Not to say that it wasn't before, but now, we see a lot of woke films that people describe them as such. But yeah, I see this idea of reclamation throughout the films that, we had before, films that were looking at female identities and female stories, but were being told by men. And all we have now is this idea of reclamation, in the sense that women are taking those stories and they're putting their own twist. Some of them more than others, of course. Candyman doesn't do that a lot, so it is quite an outlier in my cycle. But if we look at the first one, it kind of dealt a lot with Helen's relationship with Candyman and academia. But yeah, I see this idea of reclamation, reframing the representation, quite a lot in this cycle.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, and I think, I wonder that also that whole idea of these recent remakes as being kind of woke remakes is itself something that we might want to discuss further and think about, because it's that kind of reframing of I guess the politics of horror, and then horror fandom and how they respond to these changes, the changing dynamics in terms of horror film production, horror film fandom becoming more inclusive and diverse, and then the kind of backlash against that we see. But yeah, we'll kind of explore that more. I want to come to Kendall as well, because you were kind of referencing these earlier periods in kind of horror remaking. And do you think, like, is there a reason why horror as a genre is so kind of well suited to these discussions of kind of remaking, reanimation? I guess horror, the plots are so often about that on some level, but what are your thoughts on that side of horror as a genre, kind of taking us back into those earlier periods?
Yeah, I think Laura does a great job, and I will say this just about more praise for the book is I do think this is one of the first really serious attempts to get out of that original versus adaptation, or the question of originality, et cetera. Because you're right, Iain, horror has never been original. Right? We've always, in fact, meaning really is not original. We're always kind of remaking these things. But I think part of it is, and I think Laura does a great job exploring this in the book, the lure of the remake in horror is to add the twist that is somehow shocking. And I think that's, a lot of what horror seems, at least to me, to often hinge on that moment of narrative violation where our expectations of the audience are, we're watching a Hitchcock film and she stole some money and she's on the run and wait, holy shit, she's dead. Now what happens, right? That particular moment. And so the thrill, and I think back to, as I mentioned earlier, Jekyll and Hyde was one of those films made in the early 1900s and the 1910s. Lots of studios year after year. So it wasn't just a matter, as some people say, of they remade the property because the prints were all gone. No, there are Jekyll and Hyde that came out in 1907, 1908, 1910. So they're on top of each other. But if you look back at some of the discourse around those, it was, we are going to make the most shocking Jekyll and Hyde. We're going to make the most dramatic transformation, the most and so there is a kind of one-upping each other in terms of the spectacle and the shock. And I think what Laura captures is the way a lot of these remakes in this more recent period have tried to either turn Freddy into something much, much darker, or to give a deeper dive into Michael's, internal life in Rob Zombie's Love It or Hate It, in a remake of Halloween, all try to take this icon. And I think that's part of what Laura really does a great job of that period. There are lots of remakes before that, but this is the moment when we start getting iconic remakes. These are not just, God bless Shirley Jackson, who actually graduated from Syracuse University. So her spirit is here where I am. But, it's not like House on Haunted Hill was an iconic property. Everybody was saying, oh, of course, I know that, But Jason and Freddy and Michael and Leatherface, these are icons. And so to take up that property and say, I'm going to do something different, that is both a big challenge. And I think to Ian's point, is part of the lure of doing that. Like, how can I take that story and make it something you were not expecting?
No, that seems really good. And yeah, I think, because there's an interesting tension, I guess, with what you were saying, Laura, around on the one hand, part of the value and part of the reason that there's a positive response to a film like The Evil Dead is the idea that it's not a pointless remake because it's doing something new, it's adding something, it's taking it in a different direction. Whereas so much of the discussion around like Gus Van Sant's Psycho is the idea, well, it's doing the same again, but now in color, with very minor changes. But some of one of the defense is that we can put up against these kind of critiques is that, well, it's not quite an exact replication, that it's doing something different.
But it can never be entirely an exact replication. I think Haneke's Funny Games is a really interesting example of this, although we're not talking about, obviously the book focuses on American remakes, but Haneke remaking his own Funny Games in the States and putting it into English language, I think is really a really interesting experiment. And a lot of people made that complaint in the same way that they had about Gus Van Sant's Psycho. What's the point? You're making a shot for shot remake. Why would you bother doing it? And the truth of it is, it can never entirely be shot for shot, because even if you are to block and frame and actually film things in the exact same way, not only do you have the really obvious observable differences, changing cast and so on, but a change in cast leads to things like slightly different line readings, very marginally different changes in facial expressions, which can really change the tone of a scene, which can really change people's responses. And I actually think if you watch Gus Van Sant's Psycho or you watch the remake of Funny Games, they're really interesting from that perspective, because even leaving aside the kind of the major changes, seeing Norman masturbating or the DVD rewind in Funny Games instead of the VHS rewind, that kind of thing, even leaving those aside, those really minor changes, if we're calling them shot for shot, it's not shot for shot. You can never entirely actually replicate unless you just re-release. And even then you've got questions with, quality and format changes and so on that will also form a part of adaptation. So I think that's really interesting. I just wanted to pick up, obviously, Kendall made some really, really important points about horror remaking and horror never really being original and one-upmanship and so on. And it kind of made me think, earlier when you asked me, Ian, about whether horror is particularly kind of prone to these complaints about pointlessness, I think horror really lends itself to the vocabulary of criticism about remakes as well. Horror films are dug up, monsters are reanimated, which is obviously the riff of the book. the book title. Old storylines are dug up, skeletons are pulled out of closets. You know, we zombify and we cannibalize and so on. And I think that those things really lend themselves. So in some ways, it's almost it's a buzzy way, it's a buzzy critical way to talk about these films that I think, you know, horror is perhaps particularly prone to in ways that other genres maybe aren't as much as well.
Well, that makes sense. Yeah, it's that sense of, yeah, that it works really well for critics and for authors coming up with book titles. Like there's, yeah.
It was, yeah, that was a dream.
Now I think Kathleen, you're back now. I think there was some connection problems, but yeah, I guess I've got, two questions for you joined on. There's the kind of first one, which is just, we were just talking about funny games, and I know that you've written on funny games. So just, I guess if you can add your thoughts to how funny games complicates or adds to this discussion. But then also, given that you've done work on the kind of Jurassic World series, and I'm interested in all the different terms that are being thrown around, the kind of remake, the sequel, the reboot, the requel, the legacy quel, like these kind of endless attempts to kind of grapple with the slightly different forms of remaking seriality. So I was wondering if, from your kind of research into the kind of Jurassic World franchise, you've got thoughts on the best ways of approaching that kind of proliferation of terminology.
Yeah, well, I'll try, but yeah, well, thanks for waiting for me. And sorry that I got kicked out here, but I hope I didn't miss too much. I noticed that it was also about Psycho and the pointlessness, I think, which of course is something that funny games, yeah, was also, I mean, it was the same kind of discourse surrounding funny games. Except that it was also an auto remake. So Michael Haneke remade his own film, which made it all the more blasphemous somehow. So why would he do that? And it was this kind of pointless thing where critics really freaked out. So because when they watched it, they were like, but he made me watch it again. So there was kind of like the major criticism they launched at him. But yeah, but I wanted to maybe as a starter, like I'm not a horror scholar, but I'm a remake scholar, and I can't get around horror films. I never planned to watch many of these films, and I found them really, really interesting in how they actually manage these kinds of changes. And of course, we do have Psycho and funny games as these really interesting examples that kind of really raise theoretical questions about what remakes do, what repetition can do, and specifically with, and it's not so much about funny games, because I think I have to move back to Psycho here, specifically what the remake can do in the 21st century or around the turn of the millennium. And I think for me, that movie is actually a turning point. And I know it's kind of a starting point for you as well, Laura. But for me, it's kind of a turning point when remakes start to do different things, when it's about, so it can't just be repetition. I mean, remakes beforehand already play a little bit with, you know, you have to change the ending, you have to put some kind of more difference in there than the changed setting already can provide, like the cultural context and so on is different, but it cannot be a remake that adds something, like adds technological innovation, as we had with the sound film remakes, for example. And when you go back to the introduction of sound, we had the exact same story, sometimes the same actors, and it was just about keeping the story alive. And that all changes once we get these kinds of opportunities for repeat viewing, to get to see it on television and so on. And they become really, like we have these iconic characters that are also present in culture, and they are present on television, they're present in your homes, on DVD, on VHS before that, on streaming platforms and so on. So I think Psycho was one of the films, and Planet of the Apes, Tim Burton's remake from 2001, was the other one that really showed, okay, so we can, like, we have to rethink the way, or the studios have to rethink the way they actually approach remaking. And this is where things, I think, also get more complicated with the terms we use, because it's not just about providing, repetition with a difference, and with difference like in small letters and repetition in the big letters. But it's about, for example, providing a backstory, something that adds something else to the remake and makes it interesting also in terms of world building that you also write about, Laura, and this idea that you can actually gain something from watching this new iteration, right? So you can gain something from knowing about the other one and being really a proficient viewer. So the intertextual proficiency is really has become part of the remaking process. So it's not only about reaching new generations of viewers, which was the main thing in the past, long time ago, but it's really about kind of continuity in all terms, even if the remake itself is not concerned with continuing and on the level of narrative with continuity. The remake we've called this also second order serialization and so on. So it's on another level and a more abstract level, it's concerned with continuity in many ways. And I think that's something that changes. And then in addition to that, in the 20th century, and that was all in the 21st century, and that was also what my question was really about, we see this acceleration where it's like, okay, so this doesn't work anymore. Let's try this, and let's try the reboot, for example, in the mid 2000s, right? We have Batman and we have the new James Bond and so on as these kind of complete course directions. Okay, so we do something completely different, a new style, a new actor, and it's going to be dark and gritty, and it's going to be, it's going to be also more sequelized in many ways with James Bond and so on, and that is not something that, for me at least, has worked out either, because and I think you also make a really great point, and I think it's chapter 3 that you have, that it's not so much about erasing anything or supplanting anything, because that's against this idea of actually establishing this kind of continuity. Like, no one wants to replace anything. I think there are just these few examples in the 30s where you have these disguised remakes that are really trying to kind of fool viewers. And I have a lot of examples actually in my book where you have like fan letters and also other viewers who are really, really annoyed by that, and they say like, I don't want to be fooled. Don't sell me. Like, I've watched this movie 2 years ago. It's exactly the same one, but it has a different title. So it's not about that, but it's about really kind of opening up, trying to provide different perspectives and so on, and especially not about trying to erase any kind of history or of the franchise. So the franchise past becomes like this really, really important selling point, actually. And the question of, it's almost like an operational aesthetic, like what can we do with the franchise past now? Like, what can we do in our cultural context with our cultural sensibilities? Like, how can we still try to make something new with that? And I think, and I've written about Jurassic World, and Jurassic World does that. But even within Jurassic World now, with the third film, I mean, even like, I think already in the second film we have Jeff Goldblum again, and now in the third film, of course, we have all the old cast come together again, which I think is also a way of showing, okay, so it's about bringing these things together again. It's not about like the notion of the reboot. I'm very critical of the reboot. I don't know that has become clear in my writing or not, but I'm very critical of the term reboot, because for me, it's just another term like also like franchise, or like, it's a way, or reimagining. It's a way of discussing these things in a different way. And specifically reboot, for me, oftentimes it's another term for remake, something that kind of avoids the negative associations that we have since Psycho. So sorry, I can keep on talking. I don't want to do that too much, but I think it's really interesting to still kind of grapple with these terms and try to find out how they are used as communicative terms and like their communicative function. So what do I actually like what for example, what do the studios mean? What do audiences mean when they use the term reboot? How do they understand them? But then as scholars, we can analyze those terms. And I think that's something I also really like about your book, Laura, because I think that's also what you're doing in your chapter 3, where you're talking about also critically looking at what reboot means when we look at those kinds of horror films. Maybe you want to add to that as well.
Yeah, sure. I think you're absolutely right. These terms just become kind of interchangeable, and they're used in ways which don't actually seem very discriminate. I think our natural inclination, not just as scholars, not just as academics, not just as people who study adaptation and seriality, also as human beings, is to categorize and label and to put things into little neat groups to try and make sense of them, right? That's how we understand stuff. But it just can't work like that. And I think that particularly with contemporary adaptation and seriality, those forms and those kind of the nature of intertextuality as part of serial adaptation is so key, and really kind of makes clear categorization very, very difficult, and also kind of ineffective. Like there's very little point. I don't want to use the term pointlessness when we've already critiqued it enough tonight, but it is, I think it's very difficult to kind of come up with new terms that are actually useful in analyzing and categorizing these things. And I think the same is true of requels, legacy-quels, reboots. They're all much of a muchness, particularly when you're talking about franchise adaptation and you're talking about films that have had so many different serial forms throughout their history. So yeah, I think that's really key. And I think both you, Kathleen and Kendall, were talking about this idea of kind of having to relate back to what's come before, having to not overwrite these things, because that's another frequent complaint, that these new versions kind of overwrite originals, and that it's disrespectful or it disavows an original film somehow, which of course is nonsense, because they have to actually recall what came before. They have to remember, you have to memorialize it, you have to centralize it, and it's used as a kind of a process of recognition. We use it as audiences, but it's also used in terms of branding and in order to market these films as well. And in turn, I think it's also important to note that every new version of something plays a little part in the canonization of what's come before. So, with Gus Van Sant's Psycho, we can talk about it being disrespectful to the original if you want, but ultimately, doesn't it just help people to kind of become more familiar with Hitchcock's film, if that's remotely possible? Yeah, so I think it's very, very, very interesting points.
Right. Well, thanks. Yeah, no, there's so many possible ways that we can take this conversation further, but I'm also aware that we want to kind of bring in some of our audience now. I can see some people have been putting things in the chat. I think maybe Mairead, would you like to ask your question, or I can read it out, but if you'd like to ask it, that might be nice. Oh, mic is broken. Okay, I'll read it. Okay, so yeah, Mairead asks, would this proficiency, so what Kathleen was talking about, be part of why we have these cycles of remakes in horror, as opposed to a cycle of slashers or a cycle of haunted house movies? What is the difference or the complication of a cycle of remakes to a cycle of a subgenre like slashers or haunted house? That kind of, I guess the kind of proficiency that audiences have with all of these earlier films. Any thoughts?
I mean, I'm happy to just, I think Kathleen might have follow-up thoughts as well, given that we were talking about proficiency. But I think one of the really key things that I tried to do in the book is to think about these films in terms of where they sit within the genre, or where they sit in terms of other productions, and not just in terms of little cycles of remakes. So these things are obviously as much a part of kind of genre and other forms as much as they are just little cycles of adaptations. So rather than thinking about them as say a cycle of remakes, especially because they were so prolific throughout, really the book is looking at kind of a period of about 15 years. And at that point, you know, we've gone way beyond the idea of a cycle. So I thought it was much more fruitful to look at them in terms of how they connected with other things within the genre. So I tried to think about slasher remakes in terms of where they sat, you know, in terms of other slasher production, and how they were kind of introducing ideas that then other slasher films, or even other films outside of the slasher subgenre, moving out into the genre more broadly, were kind of adopting from those remakes. So I think it's really important to kind of detach remakes not only from their originals, but to kind of detach them from each other a little bit as well, and to consider them as part of, you know, within their kind of genre context, reception context, industry context, in terms of what studios were doing, in terms of what was happening in the genre, in terms of how audiences were receiving horror at the time. And I've tried to make those connections throughout, but I think that's really important. I think that's a really important way to consider them. Kathleen's gone dark.
She's gone again. Okay, well, let's yeah, we've got loads of questions.
Thanks, Ray. That's a really good question.
Yeah, is it Ido got a question? Do you want to ask it yourself? Ido Rosen. Or I can.
Ido says, please read it.
Okay, sorry. Yep. I wonder if the common discourse about remakes and reboots, like the kind of critical dismissal of these, can be applied to international remakes as well. In your opinion, what changes when the film is remade in a different country?
Again, I mean, I can tackle this. One of the reasons I didn't include transnational remakes was because I mean, I'd looked at that in my MA. I'd looked at American remakes of Japanese films. But I think there's already an idea that the American horror remakes are cross-cultural in the sense that they're remade across time. So looking at something in a contemporary time period, as opposed to looking at something made in the 1970s, there is that, you know, there is already that difference between those two kind of time periods in terms of culture, in terms of society and politics, and all sorts of other contextual ways that we might like to think about them, as well as industry. You know, the industry changes so much in America during that time period. So I think that's one key thing. Another thing was that there's just too much to consider to draw that in. Once you start thinking about how things change across culture in terms of place, you're not only thinking about industries, you're also thinking about cultural contexts in terms of the text themselves, but also in terms of audiences, in terms of the way reception occurs, and the processes by which people get to see those films and what they make of them, the way that certain kind of themes or stories have to be adapted in order to either make sense or resonate with new audiences in different countries. I mean, Iain's actually much better placed than me to talk about this, so you might want to answer that yourself, Iain, or just pick up some key points, because I think you know, you're obviously the expert in this area.
Well, no, thank you. I mean, I guess, yeah, I don't want to take up too much time, but yeah, I'll say that I think, yeah, the part of what you were talking about earlier around the kind of pointlessness of remakes, the transnational remakes almost always have a sense of, okay, it's being changed for a different cultural context. There's always like, and not the kind of value of watching that and also studying it is often sometimes kind of underpinned by that idea of kind of cross-cultural exchange and cultural difference. But then it poses a whole set of challenges for scholars in tracking that. That if you're doing American remakes of American films, then okay, you've got a stable kind of corpus of like, okay, this is the films I'm looking at, here's the cultural context. But if you're trying to track remakes, I mean, as I stupidly tried to do in like in Turkey and the Philippines and India and Brazil, all these different contexts, that becomes an impossible project on some level. So it's you can do some of it through collaboration, but yeah, so I think there's just I think the challenge of studying kind of cross-cultural remakes on any kind of large scale to track kind of industry trends becomes really, really challenging for an individual scholar.
I think also, you know, we make a lot of assumptions. I mean, I know obviously Iain, you've got way more experience in this area, but we make a lot of assumptions as English speakers. And if my only way to look at cross-cultural remakes, if my only way to look at films made in another country in a language which I don't understand is to read subtitles, I'm missing an awful lot of nuance, of context. There's a lot of things that I don't understand, and there's a lot of assumptions that I'm therefore making. You know, no matter how in-depth and solid I think my research might be, which is one of the reasons why I didn't want to tackle it in this project. I do think there's some excellent work on it, and Iain's is at the forefront of that, just to promote your book, Iain, if you want that years later.
But yeah, I guess we'll come to, so Shelley's got a question for you, Laura, that she's asked me to read out, and then I think Iain Wilcock's got a question that might be able, the rest of the panel might be able to engage with as well. But yeah, so this is one for you, Laura. So thinking about the wider denigration of remakes and the canonization of horror classics, are there any remakes that you feel have already reached the level of horror classics? So with fans, academics, or both, do you feel that the internet has accelerated the canonization of these kind of new classics in horror?
That's a really interesting question. I hadn't really thought about the internet kind of accelerating that, but yeah, I suppose it's only natural that it would do, absolutely. My first thought when you were reading that question was The Thing, The Fly, that we've already mentioned, you know, where those remakes have kind of superseded, for many people have kind of taken over from the original films as the definitive kind of version. In terms of the internet, yeah, I think it's possible. I think perhaps it speeds up reappraisal and provides space for fans and audiences to reappraise texts in ways that maybe took a little bit longer before. That said, I mean, it's been, you know, I said earlier about Texas Chainsaw Massacre having a little bit of a reappraisal, and you know, that seemed to come out of nowhere a couple of years ago. You started seeing, you know, lots of horror critics saying that actually they'd always really loved that remake, and that's really not the response that it had initially. It was, you know, really not ever so well received. So it's interesting to kind of see those new narratives kind of appear. I think it'd be really interesting to trace those and to look back and see where that comes from, because yeah, I think the internet probably does play a massive part in that, in a way that you know, maybe films before took a generation really to kind of pick up and you know, and to what's the word I'm looking for here, to kind of receive the acclaim that they were probably due. Yeah, that's really interesting. I need to think about that a bit.
Can I add something to that?
Yeah, go for it.
No, it's just because when we're talking about remakes and then we keep talking about these films, I go back to when I first started watching these films, and you know, the idea of which films are classics. I've always known, you know, Dawn of the Dead, that's a classic, but I had never seen the one before. So my Dawn of the Dead story is watching the 2004 film and thinking that is amazing. So I think that perhaps impacts as well. So, and Laura, you say that on your book as well, but what is the first film that you watch, and then you have that kind of personal relationship with the film, and that kind of becomes your point of entry to that brand.
Absolutely. So, yeah. Matt Hills has got a really interesting chapter on this exact thing, actually, the Ring and the remake, The Ring, and it's very much about kind of, I think temporal bias. I think he kind of describes it as this idea that the film that viewers see first is probably the one that they will, you know, most keenly associate. That's their original. That's the thing that they saw first. So yeah, I think you're right. I think that's a really important consideration.
Brilliant, thanks. I think Iain Wilcock's got a question that you could ask to the panel about changing social anxieties.
Thanks, Iain. Yeah, and hi everybody. And you know, brilliant to see this book out there. I'm going to do that terrible thing that we all do. I hope it's not just me as teachers, that actually thinking about something you taught today and seeing a talk, you suddenly think, oh, that's interesting, and you think about how it might apply. So today I had the first session of my digital media arts students, and I was talking really about how societal anxieties about technology are reflected in the stories we tell. And that goes right from sort of, golem myths and that sort of thing, right through to my favorite recent version, which is Wallace and Gromit in a close shave. Daddy created him for good, but he's turned out evil. And I suddenly, listening to you talk, Laura, I was thinking, now this is very interesting, because usually when we're looking at text, we have one version of that text, and we maybe can trace some connections, but it's always on the basis of one text, But actually, remakes gives us an opportunity to see a very similar story told at two different points, possibly, and I was just wondering whether, and this is very speculative, and I'm not expecting a sort of definitive, statistical level evidence answer, but I was just wondering what you thought, that actually whether we could see shifts in societal anxieties through the way the same story was told at different points, and whether, I don't know, maybe there's nothing in it, but
yes,
I was just wondering what you thought.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say is the short answer. The chapters 5 and 6 in my book kind of focus on this quite a lot, actually. The politics of remakes, those 1970s horror films, Texas Chainsaw, Dawn of the Dead, Hills Have Eyes, etc., are generally kind of thought of as being really kind of politically astute and very kind of very kind of liberal in their commentary and their themes and their message and so on. And by contrast, obviously the remakes come out sort of mid 2000s, and when they were first kind of analyzed and talked about, were very much analyzed in terms of being post 9/11 text, that those they were the concerns that these films were particularly dealing with. And actually, when you start looking at them a little closer, I'm not entirely sure that a lot of the arguments that people were making hold up, 15 years later. Where are we now? Yes, 15 going on 20 years later. I'm not sure that argument really holds up all of the time. And that firstly, we need to consider the fact that remakes might be made in kind of politically blank or neutral ways in order to appeal to audiences. Secondly, that we can read pretty much whatever we want into anything, because textual analysis is subjective, but also that yes, quite often things do kind of move along, and obviously even if it's kind of subconscious, things are made in their moment and things are watched in the moment in which we exist and in which we are receiving things, and the things that happen around us and the things that happen around filmmakers all have an impact on how those things are made, the messages that they convey, and how we receive them. So yes, I think is the short answer. Those things are significant. Yeah, absolutely.
I think I could see Kendall nodding along. Do you have anything you want to add on that whole kind of question?
I agree. No, I mean, I will say here, I'll prove what most of you already knew, is that I'm not actually really a film person. My background is rhetoric, and actually that's technically still what I do. And so for me, texts are always meaningful only in the context, and that as the context changes, so too does the text. So that's just a founding principle of my academic upbringing. So I am always saying, I guess I'd push back a little on the idea that anything can be apolitical. That we may have to have a longer drinks conversation about what political means. But I certainly think, to the point that, the idea that Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead should speak to 1978's emerging consumer mall culture, why would, unless it has a time machine, it would make no sense to speak to that culture, nor would that audiences be attracted. So my question is always, there is something in that Zack Snyder or in the, Texas Chainsaw remake or whatever it is that resonates with audience, that makes them say, yeah, for some reason that narrative makes sense to me. The question becomes, what in that makes sense? But holding it to account for, 40 years earlier doesn't make sense without, so I think there's an anachronism in some of that adaptation studies, and it misses the fact that audiences are live in the theater. So when I show Dracula to my students now, I can try to connect them to the context, but I also have to recognize that they are seeing the film through eyes. And I think Laura does a brilliant job in the book of kind of engaging that issue. What does it mean for people who grew up with Freddy Krueger to see a Nightmare on Elm Street remake, because as the point's been made, it's not like anybody in American culture doesn't know Michael, Jason, and Freddy. Like they're iconic figures like Santa Claus at this point. Hopefully they don't come down your chimney, but that's a different point. But it is absolutely part of that. And so I think what Laura does is avoid that trap of either the originalist assumption that you fail because you don't address to what they were addressing in 68 or 74 or 78. But she also doesn't fall into the trap of trying to see these in a different way. I think what Laura does brilliantly is say, what is the work these films are doing now? Like what is actually being done in the film and not tied into that. And I think that is a refreshing, refreshing take. And if I can just say one more thing, I know I talked too much. What the other thing I love about Laura's book, because I just don't know if we'll get a chance to say this, and if those of you haven't read it, you should read it, because not only is it brilliant and smart and very very systematic and like really great scholarship, but Laura calls people out for sloppy, shitty, bad scholarship. Like in fact, the third time I found one of her really funny and very snarky takedowns of some bad, sweeping statement, I immediately, because I was reading this I got an electronic copy. This is embarrassing, I searched my name to make sure that I was not going to find myself on page 124 going, and that idiot Phillips said. I was thankful I just found myself quietly in the end notes doing that. So I was like, whew, because I suddenly thought, oh shit, she really could take me down for this too. So thank you, Laura, for sparing me the double barrel shotgun. But I also say, anybody's interested in these topics and horror studies, Laura's book is a must read, because it really is. It is. I think it's the definitive work in this kind of area. It's absolutely brilliant. So.
Thanks, Kendall. That's very kind. I will say I had to tone down. I think we all do that thing in our PhD where we're so desperate to prove our originality of our argument and our purpose that we are actually quite cruel. And I think I took a lot out, and I tried very hard to be a little bit more objective. Maybe I was not not as gentle as I thought I was being. Yes, I will. But yes, no, I definitely do take some people to task. No names.
Brilliant. No, that's good. Yeah, and yeah, we shouldn't mention them. That should be a kind of teaser for people to go and get the book, find out who Laura takes down. But yes, Simon Brown's got a question. So yeah, that I'll read. So it's two-pronged. We're seeing more and more remakes which cross either from film to TV or vice versa. Many of these, such as It or Interview with the Vampire or The Mist, are re-adaptations technically, because yeah, they're both adapting a source text. So how does the notion of remaking adaptations within horror and remaking across media, from film to TV, muddy or enrich the concept of remaking? So that's I guess a question that anyone on the panel who would like to engage with that kind of the remaking adaptations within horror and remaking across media, how does that muddy or enrich the concept? Anyone want to take that one? Oh, you're muted, Laura.
I was going to say I'm going to let Kathleen, because I think she'd be perfectly placed, and she was already in it. So.
Okay, go for it, Kathleen.
Yeah, so I think I have a very clear opinion on that. But first, I raised my hand a little bit because I also wanted to say that I really appreciated Laura's view on the scholarship and situating giving an overview what has happened and what scholars are doing, or well and maybe not so well. So I really enjoyed that part too, and I think it's very helpful for anyone who wants to get into either the remake studies, horror genre, and I think that's very helpful in your book as well. So yeah, that's really great. On the question of adaptation and remaking, I think that's the only thing, and I might be in the minority here, because I'm very strict about the change in medium. So for me, film remakes, film remakes of films, remakes, those are the only remakes there are for me. So, that of course complicates things a lot. And so if it's from film to TV, for me, that would be a change in medium and therefore adaptation. And a lot of different things happen there. And I think that's, for me, the most important thing when I look at film to TV adaptations. I have to take seriality in a different kind of way into account. So I have to really focus on different ways of how television serializes text, which is of course we have to talk about temporalities and so on. And so for me then we talk about film remakes, but as Laura also points out in her book, the problem then is what do you do with sequels, prequels, and so on. And for me, like I combine them under a broader concept of remaking, but all within the medium of film. So that's how I deal with it. And I was actually surprised that the title of your book is horror remake and not horror franchise. At some point I was thinking you're talking a lot about sequels and also about the reboots and about franchises really and how they continue, which I really, really appreciate a lot, that you do not do case by case study original remake, but really have a broader look, which I think is very very important if we want to study these kinds of films and how the genre evolves as well through these kinds of films. So yeah, but that's my take. So yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kathleen. I think yeah, Kate, I think has the next question. If you do you want to ask it yourself, Kate? Happy for me to read it. Okay, cool. So yeah, in the book, Laura, you write about a number of films from that period, from 2003 onwards, that remake controversial films from the 70s and 80s, some that were video nasties, Last House on the Left, I Spit in Your Grave, The Evil Dead, Maniac. So to what extent do these remakes address that kind of controversy and the kind of notorious reputation of the original films they're remaking? Like, is there a sense that they're trying to live up to or surpass the notoriety or extremity of the originals? And is that a common process when remaking horror, that they're in a kind of dialogue with the reception trajectories of the original films they're remaking? Yeah, do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think so. I think the Rape Revenge remakes are really interesting from that perspective, particularly because they're doing two very different things. I think Last House kind of tried to almost sanitize the content and produces something not quite as shocking as a result, and doesn't seem to rely on the original like familiarity with the original as much. Very much kind of ties itself loosely to torture porn, but is much more kind of drama oriented, kind of focuses much more on kind of, you know, the parents' response to what's happened, but not in the same kind of raw traumatic way that Craven's film does, I think. I Spit on Your Grave, by comparison, is very much trying to, I think, sort of one up the shocking content. And I also, you know, think that it very much relied on that idea. What was interesting about these films is that they obviously came out around the time that torture porn was starting to kind of become really what had become really prominent in the wake of Hostel and things like that. And there's a great quote actually in the book by the president of Cinetel, the division responsible for I Spit on Your Grave, talking about specifically aligning it with films like Hostel and Saw, where obviously this kind of like you know, supposed extremity, because I'm not sure how extreme Saw really is when we look at it now. I think it got tied up on account of its marketing and its story rather than actually the content in there, whereas Hostel is perhaps particularly riffing on some of that earlier unpleasantness. I think and they really did very much intend to tie it to that. But if you look at the promotion for I Spit on Your Grave, it's taking and riffing on that same kind of the cover image, the poster. Miyazaki's film's got, you know, Jennifer Hills in her torn underwear brandishing a weapon. We don't see her look like this at all in the remake, and yet they take that image and replicate it almost. So yeah, very, very much the case that they're capitalizing on that, I think. Yeah, I don't know if that answers. Hope so. Yeah.
No, I think so. Yeah, I think we're coming towards the end, but I think there's two more questions in the chat, so I'll try and get to them both. So I think Tom Watson's first. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, no problem. Can everyone hear me all right? So I've got these newfangled AirPods in. I don't know if it's working or not. Is that all right?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Nice one. Iain, you're nodding and smiling. I'm going to take that as an affirmative. Nice one. So I was just kind of thinking what some of the comments have been made before, especially around sort of remakes, either adding or kind of confounding expectations and things like that. And also there was a comment made about where the idea of a remake maybe falls into other discourses, if it's across media or different forms of media. So I was kind of thinking about, I'm going to do that thing when I'm sort of riffing on some of the stuff I've been looking at myself in relation to music, and especially certain artists who have kind of either written alternative soundtracks for established films. So there's been people who've kind of worked on alternative Friday the 13th soundtracks, which have kind of altered maybe iconic kind of soundscapes or even soundtracks or kind of things like that. So I was just kind of wondering if that has kind of maybe figured. I mean, I haven't read the book, Laura. I do apologize because it is incoming in the post as we speak. I've been assured. I was just kind of wondering if maybe that's been accounted for anywhere, or if there's been any kind of work that you might have came across that kind of speaks to that in any way.
I don't think there has actually, Tom. Maybe that's one for you. Maybe you need to do that.
I'll write it.
you will write it. We will cite it. If you write it, they will cite. I think that's really interesting, and I think certainly score and sound is something which is repeated in a lot of these films as kind of iconic moments. So I'm thinking about like the sound of the camera whine in Texas Chainsaw. That just comes up again and again and again. Friday the 13th uses bits of Harry Manfredini's score. Yeah, it's definitely there. It's definitely there. I think it's a shame there isn't very much about it, and I'd like to have had some more space to write about it, but it's definitely one that needs to be explored and developed. I think. I'm not sure, maybe I don't know whether Kathleen, Iain in particular, but anybody else is aware of kind of work on remaking sound and score and soundtrack. I don't know if there's anything that you can think of.
I know that, sorry, Dan Golding in Star Wars After Lucas, he writes about, John Williams and the music and how it's being reused in the Disney reboot. But that's the only example I know. I don't know, Iain, if you have more.
I remember there was some work on kind of Japanese horror and remakes in terms of sound design. That touches on some of this, but yeah, I think it is a fairly unexplored area. But yeah, maybe that's work for you to do, Tom. That sounds good.
Well, I've kind of talked myself into it now. Brilliant.
More
cool.
Collaborative work, Tom. Let's just add it to the list.
Put it on the list. Put it on the list.
Okay, and I think, I mean, I know that we're right at the end of our time, but I want to get through the final question, which is from Phil, which is there a strong difference with who is making the remake? So Rob Zombie has a voice and a vision, Aja with Hills, Alvarez with Evil Dead, Platinum Dunes remakes. We're more about a Loock with a choice of music video directors. So there's the kind of, I guess, the critique of the Platinum Dunes remakes, that they're slick commercial visual approach to otherwise kind of grindhouse feel. Does that commercialize and dilute it for a new audience? So do you have thoughts on that? The kind of, I guess, yeah, there's an idea, there's the kind of auteur figures who have a vision, and then there's the kind of music video directors who are just making something slick and commercial.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think undoubtedly that was a big part of the complaint about things like the Platinum Dunes remakes. Those kind of tobacco and sepia tone filters, just like that sort of general sludginess and drudginess, the fast edits, all the choppiness and stuff that makes them look like music videos. And and I think that was really apparent. A lot of the directors have kind of come out of that end of the industry as well. And obviously Zack Snyder, Dawn of the Dead, that was his kind of background too. So I think you've got that on the one hand, and then you do have, and that was obviously a big point of complaint. But what's funny, I think, like there are remakes like Alvarez's Evil Dead, like Frank Halfoon's Maniac, almost like Rob Zombie's Halloween, although a lot of people also complained about that for the same reasons, and there was a lot of, as I understand it, you know, some kind of studio interference there in terms of Zombie's vision. But those other films, which are kind of perhaps more unique, perhaps more individual in their aesthetic approach, and certainly they were very well received by kind of the horror press, like Fangoria and so on, like really praised Maniac in particular, but Evil Dead also, you know, had a lot of very good critical response on account of its, you know, its willingness to kind of experiment, change, do something a bit new and a bit different. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks, Laura. Yeah, so I think, yeah, that's an appropriate point on which to end. So yeah, I'd just like to thank Laura for presenting her work to us. I'd like to thank our panel. So yeah, Kendall, Kathleen and Bruna, and thank you all for coming along. I hope you enjoyed it. I've certainly had a really great time listening to all of this discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks for coming, and thank you so much, Iain, for fantastic chairing, and for Kendall and Bruna and Kathleen for fantastic contributions and being very kind. That was nice. And thanks for a great discussion, everybody.